Okay. Recording in progress. Got it. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carla Weber-Wandell. I'm the Communications Manager at the Office of Student Financial Aid here at UW-Madison. I actually just finished or into now my 17th year in financial aid and at UW. I've actually only ever missed one college goal in all of those years. I've not presented all those years, but I have volunteered and have done this presentation for the last handful of years because this is such a great event. It's one that I love. I think it reaches people so wonderfully statewide. So really happy to be back this year. With that though, I do have to give a caveat that my FAFSA pro status went to 0 as of 24-25. A year ago, man, I could tell you anything about the FAFSA inside and out. I knew it all. You might have heard there are some pretty big changes to the 24-25 FAFSA, which is what we'll be filing during College Goal Wisconsin with our students and their families. So I've been doing my best to stay as informed as possible and try to get back to my expert status, but I am not there yet. So I'm doing the best that I can today, so give me a little grace. And I will also say that for the other financial aid professionals in the room, if I say something wrong, or if there's something I miss, do not hesitate to correct me. I will not be offended. I will not be bothered. This is definitely a year for collaboration because we all are getting through this together, right? No one's really alone in trying to survive the FAFSA changes. Okay, so before I actually get into the FAFSA itself, I was hoping to get into this earlier and like set up a poll and do some things, but wasn't able to do it. So if you have not filled out a FAFSA before, can you please comment in the chat that you have not done a FAFSA before? If you have done a FAFSA before, that's great. I just want to know if we have any true newbies out there who have never done a FAFSA before ever. I'm just going to wait for a few minutes to see if we have any newbies. Okay. Maybe we all have people that have done this before. Oh, we have one person that has not. And a long time ago. Okay. Okay, so because we are kind of leaning more towards people who have done it more recently than not, I am going to probably reference some differences between last year and this year. The thing to remember though is if you were a newbie, don't focus on anything I've said as to what it was like in the past. All you should focus on is this is what it's going to be like when you go in to do it. But for people who have filled it out in the past, I do want to point out where some places will be noticeably different. So just to kind of put that out into your brain spaces as well. Okay, so let's get into some screen sharing here. I thought I had everything pulled up correctly, but I don't completely. So let's get to the right spot. So hopefully you all see a FAFSA main page. Get ready for loan payments. Hold on, let me see. The downside when I do this is I lose my chat. Let me move my chat. Okay. I want to make sure I can see things coming in and I can see all of you. Okay, so we are on the FAFSA homepage. Can someone just type in like a yes, they can see it, or give me a head nod that we're looking at the FAFSA homepage? Or you're not seeing it? Okay, thank you. Before we can actually talk about the FAFSA itself, we do have to kind of talk more elephant in the room, which is the Federal Student Aid ID, FSA ID, and password. What is kind of different this year is that this will be even more important for folks to have created in advance of doing the FAFSA. In years past, students could show up to College Goal Wisconsin and do their FSA ID and submit their FAFSA that same night. It will not work that way this year and moving forward. Because of changes to how the FSA ID is being created and the fact that everyone will be required to have one, that includes people without a social security number, that is a change for this year. It causes a delay, about a 3 to 5 day delay for that ID to be verified. And that delay has technically always existed. It was just the FAFSA then technically wasn't processed when it was submitted until that verification was also complete. Well, now, because of how this data exchange is happening from the IRS, the FSA ID has to be verified before it can connect to that data exchange with the IRS. So although a student may be able to start their FAFSA, they won't be able to do much with it if that FSA ID wasn't created far enough in advance. Same thing with a parent. You're going to have those same difficulties that if they are doing it that same night, they'll be able to start the FAFSA, but they won't be able to get very far into it until that FSA ID has been verified. And again, they're saying it's about 3 to 5 business days for that process to happen. I don't know that College Goal or people hosting the events have much outreach to this regard to tell folks to have it done in advance. I know some of our local high schools here in Madison have done a really great job of pushing that out and getting students to do it in advance. So hopefully we have more people there than not ready to go with the FAFSA, but just be prepared that you may have some people that get more stuck than they would have a year ago. Couple other things to note with the FSA ID, especially because we are working with a lot of high school students. This is just a reminder that they should not be using their high school email address when they're creating the FSA ID and password, because they're not going to have that high school address for very long. Some students use their college email address. We don't really recommend that either. Same thing, they won't necessarily have it forever. So do also have some awareness of how to create an email address. Know, a Gmail or whatever other accounts there are these days that students get email accounts through. But besides that, it's also important to know that FSA IDs can't share email addresses. So if a family shares an email address right now, parent will have to use that for their FSA ID and student will have to get their own separate email address. They can't share them across FSA IDs. So have just a background knowledge of what page you can send them to if they need to create an email address quickly if they don't have one already. Like I mentioned, one of the big changes for this year is that for the first time, those without a social security number will be required to get an FSA ID and password. Their process, however, for getting it will be a little different because obviously they don't have that social security number, which is how other people are verified. I'm going to throw in the chat here 2 really great useful links that are helpful if you do run into families with parents that don't have social security numbers and need to create this FSA ID. In short, what will happen is they still start the process online, and initially they're attempted to be verified through the TransUnion process. If TransUnion is able to verify them, they're good to go. If that process fails, additional process that they'll have to go through, where they will have to submit, I never say this word right, an attestation and a validation of their identity form, along with some documentations to the Federal Student Aid Processing Center. These links have that detailed out really well. The first is actually one of the electronic announcements with the details. And then the other is actually one that I think just came out from NASFA just recently. That's a really great step-by-step guide with screenshots and everything about how to help those folks get that FSA ID and password. There is no workaround anymore. There's no longer putting zeros on the FAFSA and filling out a paper form and doing paper signatures. That's a way of the past. Everything now is done online with these FSA IDs and passwords. You may also see it listed as your studentaid.gov account. Those terms are really used interchangeably. Studentaid.gov is the website, so studentaid.gov account, but in a lot of places you still see it listed as the Federal Student Aid FSA ID, but interchangeable in how you refer to them. Okay, questions on the FSA ID, getting it, Just to show you quickly from this page, it's actually just up here at the left. You'll either be logging in and creating an account, which starts the process. Oh, Victor, great questions. Students that do not have a social security number should not be filling out the FAFSA unless they have been specifically told by their school that they need to do so. Students without a social security number are typically undocumented unless they're an eligible non-citizen. Eligible non-citizens will have, if not a social security number, a different number that they will use. Undocumented students or DACA students are not eligible for federal aid and should not be filling out the FAFSA, again, unless for some reason their school specifically requests it. There are a couple that do. I don't know that there are any in the state of Wisconsin that would recommend that an undocumented student or a DACA student submit the FAFSA, but really we're talking about parents in this situation because parents don't have to be US citizens to be eligible for their student to be eligible for financial aid. It's just the student who does. So we've had foreign parents for years that have completed the FAFSA. They've, this has always been a situation. So this is really talking about those parents, foreign parents, possibly undocumented parents here in the US that don't have access to a social security number. Great question, Victor. Thank you for asking that. Any other FSA ID questions? Otherwise, oops, that's not the page I wanted. Oh, also a great one if you want to see all the FAFSA alerts. So from that same homepage, you can get to the FAFSA. Otherwise, the quick link FAFSA.gov still does work. You can just type in FAFSA.gov and it will take you straight to this page. And then once you get here, your students are just going to be clicking on the Start New Form. So what we're going to do though, excuse me while I just move to a different page here, is we're actually going to access the prototype. So this is the opportunity, if you haven't been in there yet, great tool, and I'm going to pop the link in here for you. Great tool to be able to get in and take a look at sample FAFSAs without actually impacting a FAFSA or being able to fill out one yourself. So this is something that even after we're done today, you can go in there. The password is on that page itself. It'll ask you for a password the first time you get in. But this is an excellent way to try out some different scenarios and see what the FAFSA will look like.
Carla, there was a question in the chat room. Is it 3 to 5 business days for a student and parent to get a FSA ID?
Yep, the verification is always business days. Yep. They say 3 to 5 days. I think it's usually faster than that, but it's hard to know. So what we've been telling students actually since this fall is do it at least a week before you do your FAFSA, just to be safe. And we spend a lot of the fall, honestly, encouraging even our prospective students, there's nothing else to do while the FAFSA is not ready. Go get your FSA ID. At least you can go have that ready to go. So hopefully some of that messaging got out and a lot of students do have this already ready to go and their parents do or other contributors do as well. Okay, so we're in the FAFSA. I'm actually going to take us one other place here quick before we go. Oh, that's not what I wanted. So what happens? I was going to have all these links ready and too busy. So this is another page. You all are welcome to refer to our page. This is what we've been using as our single source for all the changes happening to FAFSA, what's going to be different and where things are at. And I just want to do this really quickly because I think it's just a really nice way to see some of the bigger changes before we get into the FAFSA itself. So what are some of the things that are changing? Again, this is if you've done FAFSAs before. The term contributor. This is really just a change in how we're talking about who is providing information on the FAFSA. So the student is technically a contributor. If they have to provide parent information, that parent is a contributor. Or if they're married, the student is married, the student's spouse might also be a contributor. As it's always been though, being a contributor doesn't imply any responsibility for the student's cost. It's just they have to provide this information so we can determine the student's eligibility. Part of what's then also different is how these folks get access to put their information onto the FAFSA. So the student, if the student is the one who starts the FAFSA themselves, will get to a point where they have to invite their contributors to fill out the portions of their FAFSA. To be able to do that, students will need that person's name, their date of birth, the social security number, and this is the one with students that I don't know that they'll always have their parent social security number on hand to be able to do that invite, and then an email address to send them that required portion of the FAFSA. Then when that contributor gets the email, it will link to that student's FAFSA for them to complete their portion or what's needed from that contributor. And the key is that all the contributors have to provide consent for their federal tax information to be transferred from the IRS. So this is different than before what we called the IRS data retrieval tool. That is no more. We now have something called a direct data exchange with the IRS. And the rules around this data exchange are a little bit more intense, I guess is the easiest way to say it, in terms of how they're accessing that information. So people have to provide consent. If they don't, the student is not eligible for financial aid. They have to go through that process to even move forward. Okay. Let's see here. So then another big swap. Which parent rather is to be used in a divorced or separated situation? This is kind of what everybody always thought it should have been, is what it changed to, and that is that the contributing parent is the parent who provided the greater portion of financial support to that student in the 12 months before filling out the FAFSA. That is the parent who is listed on the FAFSA. In the past, it was who the student had lived with the most. And that can really change the conversation. It might not for some divorce separated situations, but there may be some cases where, especially for a continuing student, they may be switching which parent they used on the FAFSA. For a new student, you shouldn't have to worry about those switches, but just being aware for your knowledge that now in a divorce separated situation, the parent that provides their info is who provided more financial support to the student. And if that parent is remarried, they will be providing their spouse's information as well. Family size, number in college, it hasn't changed that they're collecting that information. It's just that they're getting that directly off of the federal tax return now. It's coming from your exemptions. They can't update it, which I'll show you once we're into the application itself. The interesting thing and kind of a sticking point is number in college will still be asked on the FAFSA, but it is no longer used in the calculation of a student's eligibility. So that SAI number. Kind of not sure why it's being handled that way, why they would still ask it. I think it's because some schools may still choose to do something with that information. But it is good to know that even though they're asking it, it doesn't actually impact a student's financial aid eligibility moving forward.
Carla, there is a question. I'm sorry. Will the student be made aware if one contributor is not given approval for access?
Yes, I'll show you once we get in the application. There's a really great portal that they've created that shows the student, the contributors, and where they are in the process. Great questions. Okay, so other things, assets. Change from the past. This is another thing that people, I think, were told for College Gold that they need to bring their untaxed income information. The FAFSA doesn't actually ask for untaxed income anymore. There's not a section for untaxed income like there used to be. The one question that they're sort of keeping though from that section is related to child support received. So instead of it being considered untaxed income, we're actually accounting for any child support a family received as the assets that they're reporting on the FAFSA. So it gets reported as an asset. The sum total they received in the last year is reported as an asset. It's not a separate field on the FAFSA anymore. Another big change, and this is going to be some that might affect some of our families here in Wisconsin, especially with farms, is that farm and small businesses assets are now included in the FAFSA. So it's the net worth, and that's really the key, is that remember net worth is the asset minus any debts against that business or farm. But the net worth does need to be included as that family's asset. And then education savings plan or 529 accounts. In the past, families had to include the sum total of all the accounts they had for all of their children. Now it's just the student whose FAFSA that is for that has to have the asset amount included in their parents' asset listing. Okay, and then a couple terminology things. A biggie, it is no longer an expected family contribution. And this is actually something I've actually been saying in high school nights for years of like, don't think of it as an expected contribution, think of it as an index. And they changed it, it's now an index number. So it really does describe what we're talking about here. It's a number on a scale. Now it goes from negative 1,500 to 999,999. But you can really tell students that for the most part, a negative 1,500 is really no different than a 0 EFC. There's just some other kind of behind the scenes things for us to do with that difference. But really it just is a better way to describe how we're using that number. It's on a scale, helps us determine in the financial aid office what a student is eligible to receive. Next terminology change is it's not a student aid report anymore. It's the FAFSA submission summary. So this again, just a term change. They will still get this sent to them once their FAFSA has been submitted, but now it's called the submission summary. Gives that line by line breakdown of everything that they submitted on the FAFSA. And then this probably won't apply to many of you at a College Goal Wisconsin, but they just tweaked rather the definition of a veteran to better align with the actual Veterans Administration definition. And that has to do with a student and how they get an independent status. So if you do have somebody who's a veteran, make sure they're meeting that Veterans Administrative definition of a veteran. And then lastly, unusual circumstances, kind of similarly to some other things, is really just a term change. We in the financial aid office have always been able to look at students who would otherwise be considered dependent, meaning they have to provide parent information on the FAFSA, and consider other unusual circumstances that have happened to that student as to maybe why they shouldn't have to provide parent information. In most cases, it's things like abandonment, estrangement, or abuse situations where the students had to, leave their parents' care because it's just not safe for them. So now there's a term for this in their unusual circumstances. Students will be able to complete the FAFSA now. That's also a change if they believe they're in an unusual circumstance and should be considered independent. Their FAFSA gets processed, but they just get a provisional student aid index number, and then they're still required to follow up with the school before any action is taken. So again, this process has always existed. It's just a little bit of a terminology change, but is also a good reminder that if you do have students that have to provide parent information, but maybe there's something interesting going on there and it's not quite so easy to get that parent information, there are some options, and it's definitely worth talking to the financial aid office about what they can do. Okay, anything quickly about the changes? Otherwise, we are going to dive into the FAFSA. There we go.
Carla, there is a question in the chat. How does a student invite a parent contributor if the parent contributor does not have an SS number? You stated they need name, date of birth.
Yep, that's a great question. And I'll show you in the application. I'm pretty sure it's the same way that when you go nowadays to get your FSA ID, when you go in to get started, there's a checkbox here that says, I don't have a social security number. When they check that box, it will then actually ask for their address, and it will base searching for that parent on address. I'm gonna assume it's probably the same thing for sending an invite to a contributor, but we'll take a look at that once we're in the prototype for sure. Any other questions? Okay, so these are all just my warnings that this is a prototype. There are some really weird things in here that don't work like the application does. So there are some things I won't necessarily be able to show you, but this is still kind of the best option to play around with the FAFSA and get in there. So I'm going to launch my user. So coming from the student experience, I start with logging in with my FSA ID and password. And then I'm here on the landing page itself. The students we're going to be working with are going to be starting a new form. Just a caveat here, especially because it came up in our office this morning. Students aren't going to be able to make corrections to a FAFSA for a couple of weeks yet. That's not typical. Usually it's only a few days from a student submitting a FAFSA until they can get back in to make corrections. But just because of this soft launch we're experiencing, there'll be a delay. So if a student submits it and thinks they made a mistake, they're going to have to wait probably till the end of January, early February. We don't have an exact timeline yet, but that's another area where a financial aid office can definitely help. But waiting a few weeks to get more information for that for sure. So we are starting the new form. I'm going to do this from the perspective of the student because even when a student and a parent are together, I'm just the type of person that's always going to encourage the student to be in the driver's seat because this is their college experience. This is a great time for them to take some control over that experience and what they're doing. Mom and dad can be, next to them or there to answer their questions, but I always love to encourage to students to be in that driver's seat. So we're going to be a student this morning. The first few pages when you get in here are all great, but they're really informational. So I'm going to blow through them. I will comment though, FSA is pushing out YouTube videos like almost every day in the last few weeks. There's a bunch more that just got posted today. This is a great FAFSA overview they have. If you go to their YouTube site, you can see all kinds of videos on the contributor and getting your FSA ID, all kinds of great help videos that you can refer to too. Then it's going to give information on understanding the form. So we get some information here about contributors and how they're going to be able to invite those contributors. Interestingly enough here, just based on that question that was asked, is it does also specify here that they provide name, date of birth, social security number, and email. So we'll have to see what it shows us once we get to that screen. You can also expand it a little further and it gives you a sense of what documentation you'll want to have on hand. Not everything will be needed, but it doesn't hurt to have it nearby. And then just to what to expect. They're still saying it's going to take about an hour. And honestly, from the people I've heard who've been able to get through it, they're getting through it even faster than an hour. So fingers crossed it stays that way. They did promise us this application is supposed to be easier and faster to submit. So good signs I think we're seeing there. Then you get just some information on after the FAFSA, and you might have this question pop up at College Goals, so it is good to know of what does happen after the FAFSA is submitted. And that really is simply, FAFSA is going to sit and process for a little while, especially because we're in this soft launch. They're not sending any of that FAFSA data to schools until the end of January, early February. So that's why you see here after January 2024 is when your forms will be processed. So there's a little bit of a leeway here before schools will even see that information. Once they send it to us at the schools, that's when we do most of the processing of that FAFSA and we communicate with the student to let them know, is there anything else we need in terms of documents or other pieces of information to get their aid offer together, or they'll hear from us when that aid offer is ready. So really, after submitting the FAFSA, they don't really engage with FAFSA or federal student aid at that point. It's really communicating with the school. Okay, so we are through all the informational bits. Now we're getting into the actual application itself. Few things to point out. Up here at the top of the screen, this shows you who is logged in at the time. So this is telling me that I, the student, Raya, is who's logged into this application right now. I'll show you here in a bit. When we get to it, you'll see how it switches when you're logged in as the parent. It'll say parent and then the parent's name next to it. Student identity information. So this is another little bit of a switch from previous years in that all of this information is automatically pulled into the FAFSA from the student's studentaid.gov account or that FSA ID. So like it says here, if any of this needs to be updated, they'll actually go under their account settings, and I'm going to switch back over. So if I'm actually, I'm not logged in. If I were logged in to my FSA, you'd be able to see your account and get into your account settings. And that's where you would need to update your email address or your phone number. I'm pretty sure date of birth and social security number are going to be hard to update. They've always been the most challenging thing to update. So it's also a good reminder that when they're creating that FSA ID, make sure their name is spelled correctly. First name is in the right spot. Last name is in the right spot, that they're using their social security number. We have a lot of parents who maybe swap out their children's social security number, or it's just a digit off. That can create all sorts of problems. So it's going to be even more important now when they're creating that FSA ID that they're making sure that that information is accurate. The permanent mailing address also comes over from what's in account, but it's a little bit easier to update it right here when they're filling out the FAFSA. I'm going to actually change this. So again, like I mentioned, the downside with the prototype is they didn't set it up for all of the states and all of the different schools and all of the access. So I'm going to try to do this from a Wisconsin perspective, but it's not quite going to work, and you'll see what I mean here in a second. But we still need to know state of legal residence. They'll type in, like you saw me do. It'll self-generate based on what their address was listed as. But if you need to change it, you'll see the list pop down, or I can just start typing and the states will show up there as well. And then the date the student became a legal resident. I actually saw a question pop up in one of the feeds I watch online, and the student asked, so is this the date I was born? And yeah, honestly, for a lot of students, the date of their legal residence might be the date that they were born, and that's totally legitimate. So we're going to say that, you know, when the student was born, that's when they became a legal resident of Wisconsin. So again, this blue box at the top just warns me that this is the prototype and it doesn't do everything like we like it to. So there are some situations where a parent won't have to provide any information on assets or anything. It's based on how they answer the questions. The demo doesn't allow for me to show you how that plays out. So it's good because you'll see it all, but just know that there are situations where you may not see some of the questions that you saw today because the skip logic in this application is just so great that family or that student doesn't have to complete it. So you might be seeing a lot more today than you'll see in what students are actually completing. But ultimately, what this page is getting to is the consent and approval part that I was talking about earlier in terms of being a really big change for this year, that this consent has to be granted for a student to be eligible for financial aid. I honestly haven't even read all this text yet. Ultimately, what it is saying, though, is that you're agreeing to provide this information from the federal IRS system into this application. The Department of Ed may disclose that information based on some different situations. I mean, there's a lot to read there, to say the least. So families can read it. What I would refer them more to is they did provide this beautiful FAQ at the bottom that has expansions. This is where I would focus people to if they have questions about what it means, because it does at least give a little bit better context instead of reading all of that. But you do have to approve. If you decline, that student is then not eligible, and it says it even right here, you're not eligible for federal student aid. So the application just stops at this point. So I'm going to hit approve and keep moving right along. Now we're getting into personal circumstances. Sorry, I want to make sure I'm catching all my notes on these sections. Okay, personal circumstances. For those in the past, these are what you used to see as the dependency questions. They're not outlined as dependency questions anymore. They're just called these personal circumstances. And so they're going to ask, you know, the basics of, are you married? And I'm going to play this like I'm somebody coming right out of high school. So we're going to say I'm single. I'm going to be a first-year freshman. And these classifications, again, most of the students you're working with are first-year freshmen. You might have some returners here. It's rare at College School that we have students working on master's or other professional programs, but it's definitely possible. This question for our students, if they're a first-year student, they should not have their first bachelor's degree. So you're going to say no. They will. Yeah, they will not have their first bachelor's degree. And then these are those dependency questions more specifically. So we've got students serving on active military duty. The key for this is to remember that it's for purposes other than training. So if a student, say, is in the reserves and they are active for their period of training, that doesn't count. They have to be on active duty at the time. Student is a veteran. Again, veteran definition changed, but it's actually a good thing because it matches what the Veteran Administration has listed. So folks should be more certain that they're a veteran now than they were before. Did they have children or other people, excluding their spouse, who live with them, and key point, receive more than half of their support from the student between July of 2024 and June of 2024? Yes. Then we get into, were they an orphan, meaning they had no living biological or adoptive parent? Were they a ward of the court? And again, based on being age 13 at any time since they were age 13. And the same thing with being in foster care. At any time since turning age 13, were they in foster care? Not so much with being an orphan, because sadly, once you're an orphan, that's kind of the case. But in these other two, with ward of court and being in foster care, it really is at any point for any amount of time since you were 13, were you in foster care or were you a ward of the court? So you could run into a student who at 17 is now back with their family and is, has mom filling out the FAFSA, but at 15 spent 3 weeks in foster care. That counts. They were over 13. They spent time in foster care. They do get to be considered independent, even though that parent is back in their lives. So there are some situations where that does happen, and it's good to be aware of that they still get that independent status. The next one is the student was legally emancipated minor or determined by a court in their state. Interestingly enough, the state of Wisconsin, unless it's changed, and I don't think it has, we don't emancipate minors in Wisconsin. And actually a lot of states don't emancipate minors. It's just not something they'll do, period. So if a student in Wisconsin ever says they're emancipated, that should send up some red flags. There might be something else going on, but they're probably not an emancipated minor. That's the other note too, is it's an emancipated minor. When you turn 18, you're automatically emancipated. But that caveat word there is minor. So you were emancipated before you turned 18. And then lastly, the student was in legal guardianship with someone other than their parent or step parent as determined by a court in their state of residence. Yes, McKinney-Vento is coming up with homeless. You'll see it in just a second, Anne. Great question. We're going to say none of these apply because I do want to go through the dependent portion so you can see the student and asking for those contributor information. But if a student can check any one of these boxes, they're automatically made independent and won't have to provide contributor information for a parent. They'd only have to provide contributor if it was a spouse because they were a married student. Okay, so here, Anne, is where we get into your question. So the next question that pops up is, as any time on or after July 1st of 2023, so this past year, was the student unaccompanied and either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of being homeless? And so that's where you can answer the questions related to homelessness here. Then you get into more specifics too. So if you say yes, you get into who made the determination. So McKinney-Vento status, because that's done at the high school level typically, the student would just indicate that it was done by the high school or school district liaison, unless it happens somewhere else. Even financial aid administrators are allowed to make that designation for students. So if you do have somebody in this situation, again, financial aid offices are great resources, and definitely direct the student to talk to them about that situation in more detail. So again, I'm going to say no because I want them to be a dependent in this scenario. And then we get into some more circumstances, and this gets into that new term, unusual circumstances, or what leads ultimately to what might be a dependency override. So a student is probably going to be dependent, but they've got something else going on that means they're not able to easily provide parent information. And the FAFSA actually now does a really good job of giving what those situations are. Most often, I think what we see in financial aid offices are abusive and threatening environments, or abandonment and estrangement, or incarceration of a parent. Those are probably the ones we see most often. But there are some other opportunities here for students to be considered for dependency override. If a student says yes to this, it's going to tell the student that they're a provisionally independent student. And I'll go back and correct this in a second. So we'll move forward as a dependent, but I do want to show you this because, again, it is one of the changes where in the past, a student wouldn't be able to submit their FAFSA. It would only go so far, and then they'd have to contact the school to get it going any further. Now, the student actually does have their FAFSA processed and a provisional student aid index calculated. They do still have to follow up with the school to get that provisional SAI turned into an actual SAI, but they can get through more of the FAFSA process without talking to the school initially. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to say no. Wait, why does that still say provisionally independent? This is the downside of using something like a prototype, is then it doesn't. No, okay, hold on. Sorry, I'm going to have to start over real quick. Thankfully, it goes quickly. Yeah, continue. I swear it didn't do that yesterday when I was practicing. So that must be something different. Yeah. Speed filing. Okay, here we go. No, not birth skipping. There we go. And no to these circumstances. Here we go. That's what I wanted it to look like. So then we get to the point where FAFSA is now telling us, okay, you're going to be a dependent student, so you have to provide parent information on your FAFSA. It helps us determine what you can get. Students that get to this point can say, I still don't want to provide my parent information, and then can be eligible for just the direct unsubsidized loan. Of course, we're never going to recommend a student go this route unless it's really their only option. It's another great opportunity to have that student follow up with the financial aid office. Sometimes, you know, we as the financial aid team can talk to that family and encourage them of why it can help and be important for that student to have access, as well as remind them that it doesn't mean that they're responsible for any payments or bills related to that higher ed cost. So we're going to say no. They're not unwilling. And then we get into some information about the parents themselves. So let's see. We'll do a divorce separated situation. But again, I encourage you to go back into this and kind of play with some different scenarios just to see what they look like. But we'll do divorce separated this time since we don't have a lot of time to do multiple. So we're going to say, are parents married to each other? Nope, they are not. In this case, we're also going to say they're not living together. They're truly physically separated from one another. What the FAFSA does now too, I think better than it has done in the past, is really help the family identify more clearly which parent it should be, instead of just saying, which parent do you want to use? So that's why it asks a series of questions of then, did one parent provide more support than the other? Well, if I say yes, then it's going to tell me to use that parent. If I say no, it gives me some other information here to keep going forward with. So we're going to say, yes, one parent provided more than one support, and we're going to say they're not remarried. So they only have to provide information for this one parent. So you can see it kind of adjusted there. I wonder if you even saw that for a split second. If there is a two-parent situation, so the parent is married, either both of the student's parents are still married together, or the divorce separated situation, that parent has remarried and both parents' information is needed, then you'll see this pretty much identical card right here that says, I think it says other parent or spouse is what's listed there. In the case of two parents, You will want to list both of their information out here. An interesting point, though, is that in a married filing joint situation, it is still the case that only one parent needs to be the contributor, have an FSA ID and password, and complete the student's FAFSA with them. If the parents are divorced or not, if they do not file jointly, that's what I want to say. If a married couple does not file jointly, so separately, whatever combination of separately, both parents will have to complete their portion of the FAFSA because of that new consent for federal tax information to be shared. When it's a joint tax return and both names are on that one tax return, only one parent has to do it. But in the case, again, because they're separate, both parents will have to access the FAFSA and be sent invites. So that might be a little confusing for folks too, especially in a married filing joint situation. When you see the two boxes here, you'll be able to invite both parents to submit their contributor information. It's just in that case, if they file jointly, only one actually has to respond to the invite. So just be aware of that little bit of difference too. If both parents in a married filing joint situation happen to log in and create the FSA ID, it doesn't hurt anything. It just wasn't necessarily needed. Okay, so I'm just going to make up some information. Oh, perfect. And to answer the question we had before, here's the box I was talking about. It does appear here as well as it did when we were talking about the FSA ID. And then, oh, perfect. Exactly like it does for the FSA ID, it does the same thing and will ask for the address instead. So that'll be the experience in both cases. If someone without an SSN is creating their FSA ID, they'll provide a password. And for a student, when they're inviting that contributor without an SSN, they will also provide an address instead. So that was a great question, and I'm glad we looked. Again, this is the place where you'll want to make sure that their email address is not the same one that they're using. The question. So parents creating an FSA ID. So in a married filing joint situation, only one parent needs to have an FSA ID and password. But in most other situations of tax filing statuses, they will each have to have their own, and it all has to do with connecting their tax information to that FAFSA. When you file separately, each person has to then attach that tax information to the FAFSA. So married filing joint is the only situation where only one parent needs to have the FSA ID and password. If they file separately, they both need to have it. I guess in divorce separated situations and it's only one parent reporting, then in that case, it's only one parent that has it. But similarly, in a case where it's a divorce separated, but that parent has remarried, it still is if that couple filed jointly, only one of them needs the ID. But if they filed separately, then they'll both need an ID. I know this is one of those areas I think is going to be a little confusing to get used to and in what areas it applies. Okay, so you can see here then that it just confirms that it has sent the invite to that email address for the parent that I sent it to. And I'll show you, it'll keep playing out here. So I promise you'll get to see more of what it looks like in a second. Then the FAFSA is going to ask the student about some questions about their parents. That's not what it said. About you and your parents. That makes more sense. So student demographic first. Parent will have to create an email address, Cynthia. You cannot get through this process without an email address. So this is one of those areas where you may need to have some prepped, ready to go on how to create a Gmail address or some other email address to get through this process. Okay, so student's gender. As you saw, I should have pointed that out. This information in previous years was kind of tacked on to the end of the FAFSA, real weird. Now they've incorporated it into the application itself, but it's really important to note that this isn't actually used for their federal eligibility whatsoever. This is just for research purposes and for them to better track who's actually getting the funds and who's eligible for what. So none of these questions have to be answered. Every one of them will have a prefer not to answer at the bottom, and students are totally open to say they don't want to answer these questions. That's up to them. So I'm just going to say I'm the German white girl from Wisconsin. Here we get into the citizenship. Again, kind of to someone's question earlier, really the only two categories that should be touching this FAFSA are US citizens or eligible non-citizens. This last category, if you have a student that is not a US citizen or eligible non-citizen, make sure they're talking to their school's financial aid office before you have them touch this FAFSA. Like I said, there are a tiny amount of schools that will have students still do this FAFSA, but it's not many. Most schools have a workaround if they do have financial aid for undocumented or DACA students. Oops, maybe I should actually make the selection. And then parent education status. Again, this is a little bit of a wording change and kind of some of the controversy in the financial aid community about how it's being asked and what it means. In the past, it was asked in such a way that helped schools determine if a student was considered a first generation, so a parent didn't have a 4-year degree. But now, based on how it's being asked, you can tell it's much more vague in the completion. So students should still answer it, but schools won't necessarily be able to use the information in the same way that they have in the past. So neither parent attended any college, one or both parent attended college, but neither completed, one or both completed, or simply don't know. Again, in most cases, this isn't really going to impact eligibility moving forward. So we'll say one or both completed. Parents killed in the line of duty. If you're working with a student whose parent was lost in military service after 9/11, they can say yes to this question. Most of the students, I only think we've seen a handful of these on our campus in the few years that this has been available. So it's pretty rare that you'll have a student, but it does happen. Completion status, high school diploma, GED certificate, you may come across those. Homeschooled students we have in Wisconsin, or none of the above. Though most students will need to have at least a high school diploma or equivalent to be able to get financial aid and go to school. So we're going to go with a straight up high school diploma. Okay, so this is where the tool gets funky, and it's just because it's the prototype. Is if I try to search Madison, well, let me just stop. I just put in Wisconsin, but if I just scroll here, it's pretty clear that most of these towns are not in Wisconsin. Or if they are, it's not like the Columbus in Wisconsin, it's the Columbus in Ohio. So this is not going to work. I mean, I can just type in anything and it's not going to give me, like, it gives me an elementary school. That doesn't make sense. But again, this is the prototype. Everything else seems to be working right in the real application, and that's where we want it to work. But ultimately, the student needs to type in the high school that they went to. Again, you can search by state here. You should be able to search by the city. You can type in the high school name, but you don't need to just be able to do the search. And then, like you saw as I scrolled, all of the high schools that are in that city will then appear here for your student to be able to click and move forward. You can confirm. That's all the information of what I wanted to provide. And now we're into finances. So this is really where so much of what was cut out of the FAFSA is really noticeable, because there's just really nothing about your finances that are asked anymore, because all of that, for the most part, is now coming from the IRS data exchange. So really what students are having to refer to now are things that wouldn't be easily reflected there, or that we wouldn't necessarily see on that tax return. So if they had a rollover, and Stu, this is going to be something that definitely applies more to parents than students, but if they rolled over either IRA or pension accounts, they'll want to list these amounts here. That's because those rollovers can artificially inflate what's on a tax return, at least for our financial aid purposes. And so we want to account for any of those rollovers when we're looking at what they really had for earnings. Amounts of college grants, scholarships, AmeriCorps benefits. This really key part is this last section here, is that it was reported as income to the IRS. It's pretty rare that students have to report their scholarships or grants as taxable scholarships, but it does happen on occasion. You will see this, I believe this is still the case, but somebody correct me if it's wrong. On the tax return, there's a kind of line next to where you report your income, where there's the letters SCH and an amount that would be listed. That's the easiest place to tell when a scholarship amount has been reported as income. But again, it's pretty rare that that happens. You'll also notice that I actually have to put at least a 0 in all of these boxes. If I try to move forward, it'll tell me the field can't be left blank. That's because they want people to actually be taking the time to read these and put in at least a 0 if it's indeed a 0. In the past, a lot of the application had zeros automatically filled in, but that's not quite the case moving forward. Students' assets. So the questions being asked are the exact same. What's different, it's what's being included. So cash savings and checking account, this question has always been the same on the FAFSA. Students got $200 in a bank account. Net worths of investments, also not changed. So we're never including the family's home that they live in as an asset. And I know I'm talking from the student perspective right now. But that's really key, is we're never talking about the home they live in or any value of any retirement accounts that they have had. Those aren't considered investments. And this is the student, so we're not going to say they have any. What has changed, though, is this consideration of business and investment farms. We used to be able to ignore them when they were considered small businesses and investment farms, but now that caveat is gone. But like I said earlier, it really is this net worth that's accounted for. And net worth is, does it say it on here? Yep. The value of the business minus any debt owed against them. In a lot of cases, these businesses, their debts are running over what their business value is. So even if they have a small business or a farm, it still may have 0 net worth. Okay, so that was the finances section. That was it. You're done. That was all they asked. And now we get into selecting our colleges. This is another one in the prototype. It's wonky. We are also getting some tips, at least for some reason, for UW-Madison. We've had a lot of students calling us, asking us for our school code, or being confused that they think they should be putting their campus ID on the FAFSA when it's actually asking for the like federal school code. So we haven't totally figured out why that's confusing to students, because that really hasn't changed as far as we know. But you may have that come up if a student gets to this part and they're like, well, what do I have to enter? What's the school code? It's the federal school code that schools are assigned, not the student's identifying number that they may have on their campus. What's hard here is, I mean, I know ours, but if I search it, it's not, these are not the actual school code. So I can't show you what it looks like in real life. But kind of similarly to high schools, you can search by state, and then you can just search by state, all of the state, and search by the city. That will winnow it down a little bit, or you can just search by the school, or even faster, if you knew the school code, it'll pull up that school directly, and then you can just select it. Another thing that changed this year is students can actually select up to 20 schools. It used to be 10 schools they could send their FAFSAs to. Now they can send it up to 20 schools. So that's a pretty big increase. So I'm just going to select a couple off this random list. I really wish they had some Wisconsin schools. I do like to show it like what it really looks like, but it's not going to happen. So just gives you the confirmation of these are the schools. There's the option here to search and select more if you want. You can view more information about that school. That's always been available at this point on the FAFSA. So not technically a change, but just in a little different spot. And then we've reached the end, at least for the student. So we've got them the opportunity this is kind of like the final screen to then expand all of these different sections, and like that submission summary will show them, it's a line by line breakdown of everything that they have put on the FAFSA up to this point. Then you can see down here, this is your first spot. Somebody had asked earlier about like, well, can the students see, you know, where their contributor is in the process? This is actually the first spot. There are a couple places you can see it, but the first place that the student will be able to see, okay, this was the contributor, my parent, I added them today, and the invite was sent. And this status will update for the student as they get further, as the contributor gets further into their process. Okay, so I reviewed all that information. It looks good to me. I'm now on my sign and complete section. So I'm promising, you know, I'm using this money to pay for my costs for going to college. I'm not in default on any previous loans. I don't owe any money back. All the things that are important that we want a student to say. Then signing, because I'm logged in with that FSA ID and password, my signing now is really just checking a box and clicking sign. And the student's done. So again, here's the end. It's kind of celebratory. You're almost there. At least the student section is complete. Oh, hopefully you saw, and I can't click away from this because I want to show you the parent contributor here, but hopefully you saw right below was another status box for the contributor. So this is a second spot that a student can see the contributor that they invited and what the status is. So sorry that went away so quickly, but I can't close out of this screen because what's really nice about how they did this demo compared to years past is it really follows the experience. So what I just clicked on, this now shows you exactly the email that the contributor will get from federal student aid when it's sent from the student, or even from the parent if the parent happens to invite the student. Different scenario, but we'll get there. So it says you can't be eligible for student aid without your input. We need your help getting this FAFSA, and we'll send them straight to this login link. Why they were invited, reasons to do it, great information in the email, but ultimately we just want them to click this login link. This is the point where they should be logging in with their own FSA ID and password as the parent. If they haven't created one, this is where they will create one for the first time if they haven't already. So I'm logging in as my parent, and it's going to show the activity right off the bat and say, hey, Raya wants your help to complete this FAFSA. And you've been identified as the parent on Raya's free application for federal student aid. Parents are required to do this. There's a help center here, and accept or decline the invitation. We're going to go ahead and accept, which then takes me to the parent portion. Maybe you saw that update here too, but now you can see at the top, instead of saying student Raya Tran, it now says parent of Raya Tran. That's who I'm logged in as and completing the FAFSA as. So I'm now in Raya's FAFSA as the parent. They need my information, some frequently asked questions, and let's get moving. They show the same 4 pages for these contributors that they showed to students. So I'm just clicking through to save time. And then we're here. So again, same thing as the student. This information is pulled over from the studentaid.gov account. If they need to update it, they do so in account settings. Permanent mailing details are a little easier to update right here in the application itself. Then we go to the consent and approval for the parent. Again, lots of things to read through. There is a great summary here at the top that I guess I didn't point out at the beginning too. Those frequently asked questions again are at the bottom, but we really want parents to do the approval because if they decline, their student isn't eligible. So we're going to ask some questions and confirm some things. Parents' marital status, we're saying divorced in this situation. We'll say our, oops, come on, type, there we go. State of legal residence is Wisconsin. Interestingly, it pulls the state of residence then the date from what the student entered, which I guess could be possible. But also feel free to update that if the parent moved to Wisconsin, earlier than whenever the student was here. And then into parent finances. And then this is the section for federal benefits received for the family. So at any point, did the parent or anyone in the family receive any of these federal benefits? And we're looking at 22 or 23, so the last 2 years before filling out the FAFSA. Pretty standard list of things. These aren't too different than what have been listed in the past. If you have any questions about what these are, let someone know. But these are pretty standard. I would say probably the ones we see most are students with free or reduced price lunch. The earned income tax credit, SNAP, we see a lot. Warning, supplemental security income is not the same as Social Security. So just because this person is getting Social Security doesn't mean they're getting supplemental security income. If the district receives free lunch, if that student is taking advantage of the free or reduced price lunch, yes, they should click the box. That's also an interesting kind of controversy because of how that's working. More school districts are just, everybody is getting free and reduced price lunch. So this may change in the future, but for now, the instruction is if your student is receiving free or reduced price lunch, whether it's school-wide or not, they should be checking that box. Ooh, an info link to explain what they are. So there's supposed to be this really great help thing up here that I can't click on in the prototype for some reason. So I don't know that their help screen specifically defines what each of these are. But usually in the past, it usually at least gave a decent description or information on where to find more. You may just have to do a Google search for somebody if they are not sure if they received something or you need more information. Ooh, great question, Cynthia. No, FAFSA is not just available in English. It's now available in the 11, I want to say is the number, 11 most commonly spoken languages. I can't find a list of those languages yet, but it's most of them. I mean, it's in Spanish, it's in a lot of the more commonly spoken languages that we see in Wisconsin. And I don't know how to get to it. That's a great point. I haven't seen that part yet. There's a couple of things I haven't seen yet on the FAFSA, which is how to get to the versions that aren't English, as well as how to share information from FAFSAs for like a related parent and their student. So if one parent has 2 students in college, there's supposed to be a really easy way for them to share that data with both students' FAFSAs. But so far, everybody I've checked with, no one has seen what that magic is. So it is possible to answer the FAFSA in languages other than English. I just don't know how to tell you how just yet. So in this case, we're going to say none of these apply. I'm just taking a look at the link that Sherry included. So the paper FAFSA will still only be in English and Spanish. But it does still say it's the 11 most commonly spoken languages in the US. But it doesn't tell me what those 11 languages are. So I would assume most of the languages we'd run into are covered, but it is only in the online application. The paper application will always be English and Spanish. Wait, maybe I'm reading this wrong. And support when completing. Okay, that's a change. Because it used to be that the FAFSA was supposed to be available in 11 languages. And if I'm reading this link correctly, it says that that's not the case. So we're going to have to look into that a little bit more. I'm sorry. We can at least say that it's in English and Spanish. but there's definitely some inconsistencies here on some language availabilities that I don't know that all of us were aware of. So English and Spanish for sure, but the 11 other languages they were promoting pretty wildly this fall, which is an interesting change. So we'll have to look into that. Okay, so going back into financials, this is the part where we talked about family sizes being taken directly from the from the tax information now. So it's just saying, is it any different from what was claimed on your tax return? If yes, it will show you what had been claimed and what the application is showing and give you the opportunity to update it if you want to. But if it hasn't changed and it's the same, you can just leave it as no, it's the same as it was. And I know we only have a few minutes, so I'm trying to move quickly. This is that awful question of how many people are in college that they're still asking, but this is the one to remember. It doesn't actually change any eligibility moving forward. So for a new student, it won't necessarily make a difference. For some continuing students, there may be some pain points there. Similar to what was asked for the student, we've got information from that tax return, more details. So if there were any rollovers from an IRA or a pension, if that parent received the earned income tax credit, they should have also checked that box before, but this is also their opportunity to say if they got the EITC. It's even more rare that a parent would have grants or scholarships as taxable income, but always a possibility. And then if they had any foreign earned income excluded. Oh, interesting. So it's actually a separate question, but this asset question here for child support is part of now the assets. So it's not getting lumped in with the assets, but it is considered an asset question now. So what's the total amount of child support that parent received for the last complete calendar year? In this case, it's divorce separated situation, but I'm still just going to say 0. Assets for a family, cash checkings and savings account. Same thing with net worth and investments. Same thing with business and farms. And then same thing, you get to the end. It's even faster for the parent, right? Because they're so little once the student has most of their stuff filled in, just a couple things for the parent to do. So they can do the same thing, expand and see every answer that was put in there. And then they're taken to the signature page where they acknowledge all of those same things. Again, because I'm signed in with my studentaid.gov account, I can just check the box and hit sign and submit. And then this is another great screen that will tell you that the student's FAFSA is submitted when it was completed, that the student got an email confirming this. Go back here a second, and that after January is when this will start to get processed and that the FAFSA form is sent to the schools. And then ultimately, you have reached the end of the process. The student, like we said, because of kind of the soft launch and processing delays, they should get at least an estimated student aid index that will be formalized once we get into this kind of more, or I guess we get out of the soft launch into January and February. They also will not get their formal FAFSA submission summary until late January, early February. So they may be able to see some information and get a confirmation that it was submitted. They won't necessarily get all those details for a few weeks yet. It's also the point where they won't be able to make corrections to their FAFSAs just yet. So if something does happen, we won't have access to help with corrections or for them to make corrections until, again, later this month or early February. Let me see what other notes I have in here. I guess kind of along too with schools not getting the FAFSA data until late January, early February is also just a really good reminder for the students that you're working with that it just means they're going to have to wait longer for information so that schools are going to follow up with them. It just may take longer than they're used to hear back from us because of this initial delay in getting those FAFSAs. Okay, so I think that's covered everything. Would love to see any other questions pop in. Again, this prototype is great. You can also, besides just starting a new application, you can also look at some different scenarios of applications that are in progress. If you want to see, invited as a contributor and how they affirm that process, there are some other ways that you can just pop into a scenario and take a look. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions pop in the chat. Write them in there if you've got them. I think really the best I can emphasize is, we're all in this together. We're all trying to figure this out together and see what this first year brings. I bet next year will be a lot better. So I'll feel like my expert status is back. But at this point, really just do your best. Use your resources, use each other when you're at the events. Use those links that I sent you. Use the prototype between now and your event to just play around in it. There are some great ways. I also think it's going to get easier. We're seeing signs that more people are getting access to the FAFSA. Later yesterday and today, I actually saw blue boxes for the first time this morning, which means I could get into it, which was wild after a week of checking. So I'm hoping all of your college goals go smoothly, but I will just give you the warning that because of this soft launch and you've got a room of 50 people all trying to do their FAFSAs, they may not be able to do their FAFSAs. So we'll cross our fingers. We'll put all the positive juju out into the universe that everything goes as we need to. But just try to stay upbeat, try to help people kind of tailor their expectations that this is a hard month for everybody and it's not hurting their chances for financial aid.
There are two more questions. If a parent files taxes incorrectly, will the FAFSA flag that?
If the parent, not necessarily. So there may be a back end flag that the school is told about that they think there's an inconsistency with something that they said on the FAFSA and tax filing, but otherwise there's nothing that process is not connected, like the IRS actual filing process is not connected to the FAFSA. It's just linking whatever the IRS has on file to this other application.
And I believe there was a question about head of household, but I lost it.
No, that's okay. I actually see some other ones in here.
Okay.
So when can a student expect to see their financial aid offers from respective universities? Y'all, I decided that if there was ever a need for psychics, this year was the year for psychics. And I don't know where they've been because everybody wants to know when things are happening. And we just don't know. So even in our financial aid office, our goal is to move as quickly as possible. But because we still don't even know when we're getting FAFSA data in our hands, it's hard to predict when we'll be able to get those financial aid offers out. So what we're warning students is that they're probably going to be delayed this year because everything is delayed. And once we have an idea of timeline, we will share it with students, but we probably won't know a timeline for another 3, 4, 5 weeks yet. So other aid offices might be in a better spot if they're using other applications or have other ways to offer their students their financial aid. So have them check with the financial aid office if they know a timeline yet. But I'm going to bet most of them don't have a good sense of a timeline just yet. Let's see here. Oh, that was a follow-up question for head of household. So not to the parent, as far as we know. There might be a back end that there might be a mix-up between like a filing status versus a family status, but the FAFSA itself is not flagging that for the family. Okay, I think that was all the questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Carla. Again, you did an amazing job. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. And thank you, everyone, for attending. And we'll look forward to seeing you at a College Goal event.
Yep. And truly, y'all, if I can help or there's things that come up, reach out to me, reach out to your financial aid office that's in your community. Like I said, we're all going through this together. So all hands on deck. We'll figure it out one way or the other. And good luck. Have fun. These are such a great space to just engage with students and families. You know, try to keep it light for what challenges you might go through. Keep it light and it'll all be good. So thank you for attending. Come back tomorrow if you want to hear the same thing again. Otherwise,